The first sound was the clippers. Not the order that preceded them, not the laughter that surrounded them, but the clippers themselves, a specific mechanical drone that climbed half a register when the blade met resistance, then settled back when it cleared. The sound moved across the parade ground at Fort Harkin, the way sounds move in open desert without obstruction, reaching every corner of the assembled unit at the same moment, so that 23 recruits heard it simultaneously and understood what it meant without being told. The woman sitting on the stool didn't move. Her hands rested in her lap with the particular stillness of someone who has chosen stillness rather than arrived at it. Her back was straight without being rigid. Her eyes were open, tracking the faces in the front row of the assembly with the patient, methodical attention of a person making a list. She wasn't enduring it. She was documenting it. Then Fort Harkin Training Base, Nevada. 19 days earlier, the transport vehicle came through the gate at Fort Harkin at 0640 on a Tuesday morning in October, and the desert received it the way the desert receives everything, without comment, without adjustment, with the vast indifference of terrain that has been here longer than anything built on it and expects to remain after everything built on it is gone. Mara Stonewall stepped out of the vehicle and onto gravel that was the particular reddish color of Nevada soil after a dry summer, which is to say it was the color of something slowly surrendering to the sun. She carried a standard-issue duffel over her left shoulder. Her uniform was clean-pressed to regulation standard and entirely without insignia. No rank, no unit patch, no service ribbons, a single sheet of transfer paperwork folded in her breast pocket. She was 48 years old. She had the kind of posture that some people develop over decades of deliberate practice, and others are simply born with the posture of someone whose center of gravity has never been in doubt. Her dark hair was pulled back at the base of her neck. A faint scar traced the left side of her throat, pale and old, the kind of scar that belongs to a story that took place a long time ago, in a place that doesn't appear on maps that civilians can access. She walked toward the intake desk without looking at anything longer than necessary, but looking at everything once. The intake desk at Fort Harkin sat under a corrugated metal awning attached to the main administrative building, and behind it on a Tuesday morning in October sat Sergeant Dale Briggs. He was 51 years old, broad in the way that men go broad, when the muscle of their 30s doesn't leave entirely, but redistributes itself with less discipline, and he wore his uniform with the tight precision of a man who uses external order to manage internal disorder. He had been at Fort Harkin for 6 years. In those 6 years, he had developed a comprehensive and functional system for assessing new arrivals, a system that operated primarily on first impressions and confirmed itself primarily through confirmation bias, which made it feel accurate without requiring it to be. He looked at Mara Stonewall once and reached his conclusion before she reached the desk. He took the transfer paperwork from her without looking up from his logbook, unfolded it, and read it. Then he read it again because the first reading had produced a result he didn't trust. The paper contained her name, her transfer authorization code, and her assigned unit. Nothing else. No prior posting. No rank classification. No commendations. No disciplinary record. No performance evaluations. No medical clearances beyond the minimum required for reassignment. Briggs set the paper down on the desk. He leaned back in his chair, which produced a sound from the chair's frame that suggested the chair had been doing this for a long time and had developed opinions about it. "This the whole file," he said. "Yes, Sergeant." He looked at her for the first time with the full attention of a man who has just found something that doesn't fit his system. "You got a blank file. You understand what that means here? It means my file is blank, Sergeant." Something moved across his face that was not quite amusement and not quite irritation, but existed in the territory between them. He picked up the desk phone and dialed the base records office. He waited. He asked the records clerk to run the name Stonewall Mara against the central personnel database and report what came back. He waited for 40 seconds. Then he listened. Then he hung up without responding and sat looking at the surface of his desk for a moment with the expression of a man who has just learned something he doesn't know what to do with. The records clerk had told him that the database search had returned a security lockout at clearance level 4. Not an empty record, a locked one. The distinction was significant, and Briggs understood it, and what he understood produced in him not curiosity, but a low-pressurized anger, because clearance level 4 lockouts were applied to records by people considerably above his rank, which meant that someone considerably above his rank had decided that Sergeant Dale Briggs at Fort Harkin, Nevada did not need to know who this woman was. He made a decision at that desk in that moment that had consequences he could not have predicted and would spend a significant portion of the following weeks trying to undo. He decided that the lockout was bureaucratic error. He decided that the blank file was administrative failure. He decided that the woman standing in front of him was exactly what she appeared to be, a nobody in a clean uniform with a transfer she didn't deserve to an installation she wasn't prepared for. Barracks B, he said, end of the row, and get that hair tied back tighter than that. This isn't a picnic. She took her paperwork and walked toward Barracks B. Briggs watched her go, then turned back to his logbook and wrote one line, transfer Stonewell M. No file Barracks B. He did not note the lockout. He did not escalate the access denial. He closed the logbook and moved on to the next item on his morning list. This was the first error he made. It would not be the last. Lieutenant Callum Ferris arrived at Fort Harkin at 0820 that same morning in a separate vehicle carrying a standard inspection clipboard and a personal satellite phone he kept in an interior pocket of his jacket. He was 34 years old, lean in the way that people who have been active their entire lives are lean, with careful eyes and the particular attention to peripheral detail that develops in people who have spent time in places where peripheral detail is the difference between coming home and not. He had been assigned to General Howard Crane's administrative staff 8 months earlier, following a posting in Germany that had ended quietly and without ceremony. His official title was Administrative Coordination Officer. His unofficial function was the kind of function that doesn't appear in official titles. He checked in at the administrative building with a different clerk than the one Briggs used, logged his presence on the installation for what the paperwork described as routine inspection support, and was assigned a temporary working space near the motor pool. He set up his clipboard and his laptop and poured himself coffee from the mess hall carafe, and he did all of this with the relaxed efficiency of a man who is comfortable in temporary spaces, who has occupied enough of them that the unfamiliarity no longer registers. Then he walked to the window of his temporary office and looked out at the parade ground. The morning formation was assembling for the first full training day of the week. 23 figures in regulation uniform standing at intervals in the flat Nevada light. He scanned the faces from the window, the way he scanned everything systematically left to right. He stopped. Third row, second from the left. He recognized the scar before he recognized the face because the scar was specific in a way that faces blur over time, but specific details don't. A pale line along the left side of the throat curving slightly at the base where the underlying tissue had contracted during healing. He had last seen it in August 2004 in a photograph in a classified debrief from a Balkans operation that he had reviewed as part of his preparation for an Iraq deployment 4 years later. He set his coffee down on the windowsill. His pen, which had been moving across the clipboard, stopped. He stood at the window for a long time looking at the third row second from the left and performing a rapid internal calculation that had several variables and produced only one coherent result. He picked up the satellite phone from his interior pocket and held it without dialing. He stood there. Then he put the phone back in his pocket, picked up his coffee, and went back to his clipboard, and his pen began moving again, but the movement was slower now, and the words on the page were different from the words he had been writing before. And if you had looked over his shoulder, you would have seen that he was no longer recording inspection notes, but writing a single line repeated in different formulations like a man working through a problem that has only one answer but needs to arrive at it carefully. The line was, "She's here on purpose." Major Victor Lorne ran the morning briefing at 0830 with the fluency of a man who has given the same briefing many times and has stopped noticing that he's no longer thinking about it. He was 52 years old with the straight-back presentation of someone who had learned early that the appearance of authority is 90% posture, and who had maintained that lesson so consistently that the posture had become genuine. He wore 3 service ribbons that he had earned and 2 that had been processed through a paperwork system that he had helped design, and the difference between those categories was not visible from the outside. He stood at the front of the briefing room with a gray-covered document in his hand and talked about training objectives and performance metrics and the principles that governed assessment at Fort Harkin. And as he talked, Mara sat in the third row of the briefing room and listened with the specific attention of someone who is hearing their own words. Not approximately their own words. Not words that resembled their own words. Their own words reordered in minor ways that changed the syntax while preserving the underlying structure the way a careful plagiarist works rather than a careless one. She had written those principles in October 2003 when she was 27 years old and a captain assigned to the Army's Doctrine Development Office tasked with producing a working paper on leadership decision-making under operational uncertainty. She had spent 4 months on it. She had submitted it through the internal channels and received acknowledgement of receipt, and then heard nothing for 2 years, during which time she had been deployed to a classified operation in the Balkans that left a scar on the left side of her throat and removed her from the institutional landscape long enough that when Victor Lorne published a monograph in 2005 titled The Architecture of Leadership, she was not present to contest it. The Army Doctrine Repository had accepted the monograph. The review board had processed it without checking the metadata of the working paper she had submitted 2 years earlier because the working paper was stored in a classified archive that the review board did not have access to. The monograph had been cited widely, then adopted as foundational doctrine, then enshrined in training curricula at installations across the service, including Fort Harkin, where Major Victor Lorne now stood in front of a room of trainees and quoted himself. Mara listened. She did not move or react or write anything down. She had already written it all down in a different form, in a document that was currently waiting in a channel that would become relevant at the appropriate moment. When Lorne made an error in the third principle, transposing two elements of the decision framework in a way that inverted their logical dependency, she raised her hand. Lorne looked at her with the particular expression of a briefer who has not expected interruption. The sequencing in the third principle, she said, environmental assessment precedes resource allocation in the original framework. The order you've described produces a different outcome under time-compressed conditions. The room was quiet. Lorne looked at her for a moment. The order I've described is the order in the document. Yes, sir, she said. I know. She lowered her hand and returned her attention to the front of the room, and the briefing resumed, and nobody in that room could have articulated why they believed her, why a woman with a blank file and no rank insignia had just corrected a major in his own briefing room, and the correction had landed as fact rather than insubordination. They just did. The voice had a frequency that didn't require credentials. Lorne's face for a moment had something in it that was not anger and not embarrassment, but something older and more structural. Was the expression of a man who has just heard a sound he thought he'd never hear again and cannot account for its presence here. He recovered and moved to the next slide, but his hands resting on the podium had gone slightly white at the knuckles. The mess hall that first morning offered its own form of welcome. The servers had been briefed by Briggs's orderly in the particular way that people are briefed when the briefing is meant to be unacknowledged, a look, a word, a tone that communicates the expectation without creating a record of having communicated it. Mara received a ladle of gray watery porridge while the recruits on either side of her received eggs, toast, and coffee. She carried her tray to the end of a table and ate what she had been given with the efficiency of someone who is fueling a machine rather than enjoying a meal. And when she was finished, she returned the tray and went to the water station and drank a full canteen and refilled it because water is non-negotiable and everything else is variable. A recruit named Travis Holt, sitting 2 tables over with the attentive posture of someone deciding whether a target is worth his energy, leaned over and said something to the person beside him. They both laughed in the low-directed way of people who want to be heard without appearing to want to be heard. Mara registered it, categorized it under baseline data, and went to the barracks to prepare her equipment for the morning's training block. She was meticulous about her equipment. This was not performance. She had been meticulous about equipment since her first posting because she had learned early that the condition of your equipment tells you something about the condition of your thinking, and the condition of her thinking was something she monitored with the same regularity that a pilot monitors instrumentation. Everything in order, everything accounted for, every discrepancy noted. On the second morning, she found that someone had gone through her locker during the night. Nothing was missing. That wasn't the point, but the order had been deliberately disrupted, items relocated to positions that were close enough to correct that it could be denied as intentional, but far enough wrong that she would know. She restored everything to its position without comment and logged the time in her memory alongside the name of the recruit who had been last to the latrine the previous night and who had taken an unusual amount of time returning. These things accumulate. That was the point of noting them. In the afternoon, the unit ran a 2-mile formation march in full pack, which is not a physically demanding exercise by most military standards, but is an exercise in collective rhythm and pacing that reveals quickly who is working with the group and who is working against it. Lorne positioned Mara at the rear of the formation, which is the position where a march's pace is felt most acutely because the rear has no margin for error. Any break in the middle of the column propagates backward, and the rear compensates or falls behind. She ran the rear for 2 miles, and the formation's pace was steady, and she was there when it finished. That night, Mara slept on the bare metal frame of the bunk in the corner of Barracks B, nearest the latrine pipes because the mattress had been soaked with water from a bucket that still rested on its side on the floor, and the locker assigned to her had its door hanging off the lower hinge as if it had been pried. She stripped the wet mattress, wrung out what she could from the sheets, and laid them over the end of the frame to drone. Then she lay down on the metal frame, pulled nothing over herself because there was nothing dry to pull, and was asleep within 4 minutes. She woke before the 0500 bugle. Her uniform was pressed. She had pressed it the night before using the weight of her duffel placed across it in a specific arrangement, a technique that works when you have nothing else, and have done it enough times that the doing is automatic. The uniform was not perfect, but it was better than it had any right to be, given the conditions, and that small gap between what circumstances permitted and what she produced anyway was the first thing that made the other recruits in Barracks B look at each other with a discomfort they couldn't name. They had been told she would be gone by the end of the week. She pressed her uniform in the dark and woke before the bugle and stood in formation at 0500 with the same expression she had worn walking through the gate, and nothing in Fort Harkin had yet produced a different one. The first week established the pattern that the following weeks would elaborate. Briggs found reasons to assign her extra rotations, extra duties, extra inspections. Lorne found reasons to discount her scores. The unit found reasons that changed daily proximity to authority, the basic human drive to align with the dominant force in an environment, the ease with which contempt travels downhill when the people above you make it easy. On the fourth morning during a formation run, a recruit named Travis Holt extended his foot into the lane at exactly the right moment to catch her shin. She stepped over the obstruction without breaking stride, which seemed to frustrate him more than stumbling would have. He tried it again on the fifth morning. She had changed her position in the formation by one step to the left, which put her outside his reach, and she ran past him without acknowledgement. On the sixth morning, Briggs assigned her to clean the motor pool drainage channels, which is the kind of work that exists at the intersection of physical unpleasantness and social visibility. You do it in a place where the entire base can see you doing it, which is the point. She spent 4 hours on the drainage channels with a brush and a bucket working from the west end toward the east, and she did it with the same quality of attention she brought to everything the channels cleaner when she finished than they had been when she started, which was noticed by the motor pool sergeant, who said nothing because saying something was more trouble than the observation was worth, but who logged it privately as information. On the seventh night, 3 of the other female recruits in Barracks B moved their bunks closer together, which in the small geography of a shared barracks is a gesture with a clear meaning. Not directed at Mara, specifically directed at the situation, at the difficulty of being near someone who has attracted the kind of attention she had attracted, the way people move away from lightning rods, not out of cruelty, but out of a rational assessment of risk. Mara watched them move their bunks. She moved hers 6 inches in the opposite direction, which gave the nearest neighbor more space, and then she lay down and looked at the ceiling and thought about the work remaining and what it required. The obstacle course at Fort Harkin was 2 miles of sand and wire and timber and rope, with a cargo wall at the 3/4 mark that stood 22 feet tall, because Briggs had ordered a 2-foot extension 3 years prior and submitted the modification as a maintenance update rather than a specification change, and nobody had questioned it because nobody had checked. 22 feet is not an insurmountable height. It is, however, precisely 2 feet past the point where a tired person loses their margin. On the third morning, Briggs pulled the pressure hose. The hose was typically used on the motor pool vehicles after desert runs, a 3/4 inch line that delivered water at a pressure that moved grime off metal without damaging the surface. At the range where Briggs positioned himself, approximately 8 feet from the base of the cargo net, it moved considerably more than grime. The jet caught Mara at the base of the net with the force of something that had made a decision about her. Her head snapped back. Her grip, which had been on the second rope from the left, tightened rather than releasing because her hands were connected to a nervous system that had been trained to respond to sudden external force by increasing its hold rather than abandoning it. She climbed into the jet. This is not an easy thing to describe to someone who hasn't tried it. The water at that pressure is not water in the way that rain is water or a cold shower is water. It is a solid horizontal line of force that your body reads as impact rather than liquid, and climbing toward it rather than away from it requires a specific reorganization of instinct that most people cannot achieve under surprise conditions without preparation. She had prepared for considerably worse. She crested the top of the wall, breathing hard through her nose, came over and dropped to the other side and kept moving. Briggs lowered the hose. He watched her finish the run, then called her back to the start and told her the course was compromised and she needed to run it again. She ran it again. He found a reason to send her a third time. She ran it a third time, finishing 12 minutes after everyone else had been dismissed. And she crossed the finish line and stood upright, and her chest was working hard, and her legs were shaking with a tremor she did not acknowledge. She walked to the water station. She drank. She went back to her assigned position and stood at ease and waited for the next instruction. In the temporary office near the motor pool, Callum Ferris had been watching through the window. He had watched all 3 runs. He had watched the pressure hose. He had written 3 lines in his personal notebook, which he kept separate from his official clipboard, and then he had set the notebook face down on the desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he picked up his official clipboard and wrote 0847 non-standard training equipment, use obstacle course Briggs D, date time witness. He underlined the word witness twice. He turned back to the window. Mara was standing at ease in the recovery area with the same expression she'd had walking through the gate, and looking at her from the distance of the motor pool window, Ferris thought about a fire base in northern Iraq in August of 2008, and a voice that didn't change its frequency when everything around it was changing, and a door that opened from the outside. He thought, she didn't come here by accident, which means she came here on purpose, which means she's waiting for something. He thought, I need to figure out what she's waiting for before Briggs figures out what she knows. He looked at his satellite phone. He put it back in his pocket. Not yet. What he did that afternoon instead was read. He had brought 3 documents from Crane's staff files before leaving headquarters Fort Harkin's performance metrics over the previous 3 years, and he read them now with the revised interpretive frame the morning had given him. The numbers told one story on the surface: acceptable attrition rates, adequate training outcomes, consistent assessment, scoring. Underneath, once you knew what to look for, the numbers told a different story. The attrition pattern was not random. It clustered in ways that a casual reader wouldn't notice, and an attentive reader with the right background would recognize immediately. He read for an hour. Then he pulled the personnel files for every female officer and recruit who had been assessed at Fort Harkin and reassigned or discharged in the past 3 years, 14 names. He read through them, one by one, the stated reasons, the score, trajectories, the timing of the reassignments relative to assessment cycles. Each file was internally consistent. Each file described a different problem. Together across 14 cases over 3 years, they described the same problem from 14 different angles, and the problem was not the people the files were about. He set the files down and looked out the window. Mara had moved from the recovery area to the water station. She was drinking from a canteen with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who knows exactly how much their body requires and is supplying it without drama. She capped the canteen, picked up her equipment bag, and walked toward the barracks with the same measured pace she had used walking through the gate that morning. He thought about the 14 files. He thought about the scar on her throat. He thought about what it meant that she had been sent here specifically to this installation in this way. At this time, blank file, no insignia, 19 days before a scheduled general's inspection. He picked up his personal notebook and wrote, she's not waiting for something to happen. She's waiting for enough to happen. There's a difference. He underlined it twice. Then he turned the page and started a new list. The 14 names, what each file said beside each name, and what the pattern said beside that. The 2 columns didn't agree in a single case. He worked until the light changed. Not yet, but soon. Mail call happened at 17:30 on the 7th day in the courtyard between the barracks and the motor pool. Briggs ran it himself, which was not standard. The duty clerk handled mail call. The fact that Briggs had displaced the clerk to run it personally was information, and Ferris, who had developed a comprehensive sensitivity to deviations from standard procedure over the course of a career that had required such sensitivity, registered it from his position near the motor pool entrance and began paying closer attention. Briggs worked through the list with the efficiency of a man performing a task he has completed often. He called names. He handed envelopes. He kept the line moving. When he reached Mara's name, he stopped. He held the envelope up and turned it, not toward her, but toward the light behind him at an angle that allowed him to read the return address in the upper left corner. From his position near the motor pool entrance, Ferris could see the corner of the envelope from 30 feet away, and what he saw made him hold very still. The return designation in the upper left corner was not a personal address. It was a routing code, a specific combination of letters and numbers that appeared on correspondence between Department of Defense offices and installations rather than between private individuals. Ferris had seen that routing code before. He had seen it on correspondence that moved between the IG's office and installations under review. He took one step forward. Briggs produced a lighter. He touched the flame to the bottom corner of the envelope without announcement or explanation, and held it while the paper caught, and the routing code in the upper left corner held its shape for a moment. After the body of the envelope had gone, the character still legible while the rest turned to ash. And then that too was gone, and the ashes drifted to the dirt of the courtyard in the particular way that burning paper falls slowly as though reluctant. Ferris turned and walked to the far side of the motor pool, where a utility vehicle provided a visual barrier between him and the courtyard. He pressed the satellite phone to his ear, and his hand was not entirely steady, and whatever he said into the phone he said in a voice too low for anyone nearby to hear. But the call lasted 40 seconds, and when it ended, his face had the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he had hoped might still be wrong. In the courtyard, Mara watched the ashes reach the dirt. Then she stepped on them. Briggs watched her do it. He was looking for something in her face, an edge of grief, a crack of anger, any evidence that the burning had reached something. He found nothing. Her face was the same face it had been when she walked through the gate, when she climbed the cargo wall into a jet of water, when she ate a ration bar for dinner in an empty barracks. It was the face of someone who had decided a long time ago what they would show to people who were watching and had practiced the decision until it became effortless. He was for the first time since she had arrived slightly unsettled. He moved on through the mail call list. What he did not know, what he could not have known without the clearance he didn't have, was that the envelope he had just burned was the third in a sequence of communications that didn't require a response. The information it contained had already been transmitted through a separate channel. The physical envelope was documentation of the sequence, not the substance of it, and its destruction was itself documentation of something else. Everything that happened at Fort Harken was documentation of something. Briggs had been providing Mara with material for 19 days, without realizing that he was the subject of the assessment he was conducting. On the 10th day, Major Lorne pulled Private Weston Dreyer out of the morning formation. Dreyer was 19 years old and had arrived at Fort Harken 6 weeks before Mara Thin, in the way of someone who has always been thin, with careful, watchful eyes that belonged to someone older. He had been used as a demonstration subject by Lorne 3 times, already placed in front of the group to illustrate points about physical deficiency or improper technique, and he had learned to endure it with the specific economy of movement of someone who has decided that the least visible response is the safest one. Lorne positioned him in front of the assembled formation and then turned to look at Mara. He let the silence do the setup work in the way that certain instructors learn to weaponize silence, and then he said it plainly. The private was a liability. Was slowing the unit was costing everyone. He ordered her to correct it. The meaning was not subtle. Dreyer's eyes came up from the ground and found Mara's face. In them was the expression of someone who has learned not to expect rescue, but has not entirely stopped hoping for it. The particular combination of resignation and remainder that belongs to people who have been used as examples often enough to know that outcomes are determined before the moment begins. Mara brought her hands to her sides in the position of attention. Not deference, not submission. The specific military posture that says, I have received your instruction and am responding through my body before I respond through my mouth, and what my body is telling you is that I am not going to comply. I will not strike a teammate, sir. The words were quiet. They were also in the silence of that formation the loudest thing that had happened since the pressure hose 3 days earlier. Lorne stepped forward and hit Dreyer himself. Open palm, left cheek. The kind of blow designed to demonstrate authority through the mechanism of a body that has no authority over what happens to it. Dreyer went sideways and caught himself on one knee and stayed there for a moment, his hand against his cheek, his breathing careful. Nobody in the formation moved. Lorne turned to Mara. He cited insubordination, direct refusal of a lawful order, and the consequences for her evaluation. He added 3 demerits. He dismissed the formation. As the unit dispersed, Ferris, standing at the edge of the assembly area, watched Dreyer push himself upright and brush dust from his knee, and then watched the boy's eyes find the back of Mara's head as she walked away, and the look in them was not gratitude. It was something more complicated than gratitude, something that happens in people when they watch someone take a consequence on their behalf without being asked. He wrote a line in his personal notebook. That evening, during the equipment check at 1800 hours, 3 recruits finished their motor pool assignment in 40 minutes rather than 90, and used the remaining time to move Mara's ammunition crates from the storage point to the assignment position for the following morning's drill, setting them down with the straps straightened and the load correctly distributed. Nobody had told them to do this. Nobody saw them except Dreyer, who was washing down the vehicle bay and who registered it without comment, the way you register the first shift in atmospheric pressure before the visible signs of weather change. He went back to the vehicle bay, but he remembered it. The gear inspection on the 12th day followed the pattern that had been established since the first Lauren worked the line with the attention of a man looking for things to flag, and when he reached Mara's station, he spent longer than everywhere else. He picked up her field radio, turned it over twice, and set it down with slightly more force than necessary. A hairline crack appeared in the lower seam of the casing. He logged it as defective equipment and assigned a demerit that dropped her ranking below commendation threshold for the week. Then he told her she would carry the unit's reserve ammunition crates for the afternoon movement drill. 80 pounds in 2 wooden crates, the shoulder straps cut at an angle that made even distribution impossible by design. She picked them up without comment. She carried them for 4 miles through sand that shifted with every step in afternoon heat that had reached 104 degrees by the time the drill began, and the straps cut through her shirt within the first mile and then began working on the skin beneath, and she adjusted her hold every quarter mile with the methodical attention of someone managing a mechanical problem rather than a physical one. She finished at the rear of the formation, which was where the weight had placed her, and she set the crates down carefully when she reached the recovery point, not dropping them, just setting them down, which was the detail that Dreyer later described to the others in a low voice. After lights out, not the weight or the distance or the cut straps, but the fact that at the end of 4 miles in 104 degrees with 80 pounds and blood on her collar, she set them down carefully, as if the crates mattered, as if everything she touched was worth handling correctly, regardless of how it had been given to her. On the 14th day, Mara took a section of rusted frame through her forearm at the base of the rope bridge. It was a gash that gaped and bled freely, and she wrapped her hand around it and finished the course because there were 12 minutes left in the drill, and the alternative was not acceptable, and then she went to the medical tent. The medic on duty had been spoken to by Briggs in a manner that couldn't be logged, but had been clearly communicated. He looked at the wound for 2 seconds, looked at her face, and handed her a gauze roll from a supply shelf. Then he turned to the counter and began pouring coffee with the deliberate attention of a man who has decided to be elsewhere in every meaningful sense while remaining physically present. Mara looked at the wound. She looked at the gauze in her hand. She looked at the back of the medic's head. Then she walked out. She went to the space behind the latrines where the light from the barracks didn't reach, and she sat down with her back against the concrete block wall and took the small repair kit from her boot. She cleaned the wound with water from her canteen. The light was not good enough to thread the needle by sight, so she threaded it by feel, pulling the thread through on the 3rd attempt, and brought the edges of the gash together with her right hand while her left held the needle. The first 2 sutures were placed with her non-dominant hand. They were not fast, they were precise. She did not make a sound that anyone could have heard from more than 3 feet away. When she was finished, she held the arm up at an angle and examined the closure in the available light and decided it was adequate. She rolled her sleeve down. She stood up and walked back to the barracks and was in her bunk before the 2200 check. In the bunk to her left, Weston Dreyer lay with his eyes open, listening to her move through the barracks with the economy of someone who is performing pain management rather than recovery. He had been at the window when she went to the medical tent. He understood the arithmetic of what had happened from the duration of her visit. He said nothing. He stayed awake for another hour. In the morning, when Briggs called the formation and assigned her the ammunition crates again, Dreyer fell in 2 steps behind her without being placed there, and he shortened his stride to match her pace, and he stayed there for the full 4 miles without being asked and without acknowledgement. When she set the crates down at the end of the drill, he was 2 steps behind her, and he had not spoken, and she had not looked back, and neither of those things meant that the 4 miles had been walked alone. 16 days after Mara arrived, Briggs ordered the head shaving. The official justification was insubordination. The practical justification was that nothing else he had tried had produced the reaction he needed. The pressure hose, the extra course runs, the mail burning, the isolation, the demerits, the crates, none of it had given him what he was looking for, which was evidence of fracture, evidence that she was what he had decided she was on the day she walked through the gate. He had Sergeant Morrow bring the chair to the center of the parade ground, and he had the unit assembled, and he gestured at Mara's hair and made his pronouncements to the crowd. And the crowd responded the way crowds respond when they have been given permission by authority to participate in something they would individually decline. Mara walked to the chair before she was told to. She sat down. She put her hands in her lap and looked at the front row of the assembly and began methodically from left to right. Briggs signaled 2 MPs to take her shoulders, unnecessary, a performance of authority for the audience rather than a practical measure, and they twisted her arm behind her back at an angle designed to hurt, and she adjusted her breathing and relaxed the muscles in her shoulder, and reduced the torque to something manageable. And they pushed her head down, and she let it go down, and she stared at the gravel between her feet. She started counting faces from the gravel. The clippers hit the back of her skull. The sound was the sound it was, and the hair fell the way a hair falls in the particular silence of a crowd that has achieved what it wanted and now must live inside the achievement. And she sat completely still and stared at the gravel and cataloged what she saw. 23 faces, of which 9 were active participants. 7 were passive witnesses. 4 were visibly uncomfortable but silent, and 3 were Dreyer Ferris and a recruit named Calloway, whose discomfort had reached the level of physical expression, the slight forward lean of someone who wants to say something and has not yet determined whether the cost of saying it is acceptable. When it was done, she stood. She brushed her shoulders. She looked at the face of the man holding the clippers, and then at Briggs, and then back at the gravel where her hair lay on the ground in the Nevada afternoon light. She had everything she needed. The morning after the head-shaving Fort Harkin smelled like rain that had already given up. The kind of Nevada dawn that promises nothing, delivers less, and makes you feel like the desert itself is watching to see if you'll break before it does. Mara stood in formation at 0530, her exposed scalp catching the first gray light off the horizon. The cold that hour is a specific kind of cold, high desert cold that doesn't just chill the surface, but finds the older injuries, the healed fractures, the places a body has learned to protect over time. She didn't reach up to cover her head. She didn't shift her weight. She stood the way she had stood every morning for 16 days, as like something poured into a position and left to set. Sergeant Briggs walked the line with the satisfaction of a man who has just won something and expects to see the evidence of his winning displayed prominently. He stopped in front of her longer than necessary, studying the effect of the previous day. He was looking for the red rim around tired eyes, the forward curl of broken posture, the unfocused gaze of someone who has checked out internally while the body keeps the schedule. He found none of it. He moved on. Major Lawrence stood at the head of the formation with his clipboard against his chest, reading off the day's schedule with the practiced fluency of someone performing a role they have inhabited long enough that the performance and the reality have become indistinguishable. Obstacle course, tactical simulation, gear inspection, evening assessment. Mara registered each item and added it to the day's structure she was already building in her head. Not the structure of a recruit planning how to survive a day of training. The structure of an assessor determining which elements of the day would generate the most useful documentation. The obstacle course run that morning was meant to have one variable that the previous runs hadn't. Briggs had arranged for the course's rope bridge section to have its anchor bolts loosened on the left side, a modification that would not be apparent on approach, but would produce a sudden, significant lateral shift under body weight at the midpoint. This is the kind of modification that ends careers when it ends up in incident reports, which is why Briggs had done it personally at 0430 that morning rather than delegating. Mara reached the midpoint of the bridge at 0712. The shift happened. She felt it in the way you feel ground movement, differently from every other kind of instability, the brief, comprehensive wrongness of the structure beneath you, behaving in a way structures aren't designed to behave. Her left hand closed on the rope and her right foot repositioned, and her weight transferred in the 0.3 of a second between the shift's beginning and the point at which the shift's consequence became irreversible, and she crossed the bridge. She did not slow down. At the equipment shed, watching the course from outside the official observation perimeter, Callum Ferris wrote in his personal notebook, 0712 rope bridge modification, anchor loosening, observed 0432 during perimeter walk documented. He underlined the word documented. Then he wrote, she's still waiting. Then he crossed that line out because it was the kind of observation that didn't belong in a notebook that might be reviewed. He was learning to be more careful. General Howard Crane arrived at Fort Harkin at 1400 hours for a scheduled regional command inspection. 2 vehicles, standard configuration. He was 62 years old, broad-shouldered, in the way of someone who had maintained physical standards past the age when maintenance becomes effort rather than habit, with a chest of ribbons that clinked when he moved, and eyes that had the particular attentiveness of someone who had spent decades being lied to in various creative ways and had developed a sensitivity to the texture of what they were being told. Ferris was with him, administrative aide for the inspection, the role that required presence in all briefings and documentation of follow-up items. He carried his official clipboard and his personal tablet, the tablet face down against his thigh. The inspection briefing took place in Fort Harkin's main briefing room with gray-covered bound copies of Lorne's methodology document placed on 3 chairs, including the chair where Crane would sit. Lorne stood at the front of the room with the particular energy of a man who has been preparing for this moment for 2 weeks and is now running the performance he has rehearsed. The foundational principle of what I've developed over the past 2 decades, Lorne said, turning to the first slide, is that leadership is not a skill. It is a framework, a structural approach to decision-making under conditions of uncertainty that can be taught, codified, and measured. Crane turned a page. Ferris in the back corner of the room looked at his tablet face down on his knee. Through the briefing room window, the unit was assembled on the parade ground in the standard inspection configuration visible in the afternoon light. Mara stood in the third row. Her exposed scalp caught the sun in a way that made her visually distinct from every other figure in the formation. And Ferris looked at her from his position in the back corner and thought about Iraq in 2008, in a voice that didn't change its frequency, and a door that opened from the outside, and his thumb rested on the biometric lock of the tablet and did not move. Lorne talked for 45 minutes. Crane had asked 4 questions, all of which Lorne answered with facility and some portion of confidence. At the conclusion of the briefing, Crane stood and shook Lorne's hand and signed in the commendation form that Lorne had prepared in advance and said that the methodology being applied at Fort Harkin was exactly the kind of institutional thinking the Army needed to formalize at other installations. Lorne accepted this with the modesty of a man whose pride has learned to dress itself appropriately for company. Ferris followed Crane into the parking yard where the vehicles were warming up. Crane scanned the formation being dismissed through the parade ground gate. His eyes moved across the unit, stopped briefly on the figure in the third row. Moved on. "That recruit," he said. "What's her situation?" "Transfer, sir. Recent arrival. File is sparse." Crane made a sound and got into the vehicle. The vehicles pulled through the gate. Ferris watched them go. He stood in the empty parking yard for 30 seconds. The parade ground was clearing. Mara walked alone toward the obstacle course for her mandatory extra session, which Briggs had assigned that morning as consequence for a mail call incident that had been recorded in terms that bore a structured relationship to what had actually occurred. Ferris watched her walk. Then he unlocked the biometric on his tablet. The secondary authentication he entered from memory, a 7-character sequence he had memorized in 2019 and used once in a training exercise and never again. The screen shifted to a red-bordered interface. Classification markers, access log, a file structure that was considerably more substantial than the single blank sheet in the base records system. He scrolled past the operational summary, past the commendations, past the after-action reports from theaters whose names appeared only as coordinate strings in unclassified documents. He found the document archive. The first entry was dated October 2003. Author Field Stonewell MCPT, United States Army. Title Leadership Under Uncertainty. A structural framework for decision-making in complex environments. He scrolled down. Below it, dated March 2005, a publication by Major Victor Lorne entered into the Army Doctrine Repository. Title, The Architecture of Leadership. A structural approach to command decision-making. He stood in the middle of the empty parking yard in the Nevada afternoon heat and looked at those 2 entries, one above the other, for a long time. Then he locked the tablet and walked back toward the installation. He did not call anyone. He did not write anything in the personal notebook. He walked back to his temporary office near the motor pool and sat down and stared at the wall for 11 minutes by his watch. And then he picked up his official clipboard and began writing items that needed follow-up, because the work continues even when the ground has shifted, and the ground had shifted considerably. What he had not yet determined was when. On the 17th night, 4 figures moved through Barracks B after lights out. They moved with the confidence of people who believe the darkness is on their side, which it sometimes is and sometimes isn't, and the difference is determined by what's waiting in it. Derek Moss was 38 years old and had arrived at Fort Harkin 11 days earlier as a transfer from a reserve unit in Reno, documented as a standard reassignment and processed by a clerk who had no reason to look past the paperwork. He had a record that contained a gap from 2008 to 2009 that was attributed to a medical separation, and which in fact represented a court of inquiry, finding that had been resolved by a discharge rather than a court-martial for reasons that had to do with the availability of witnesses at the relevant time. The name on his discharge paperwork was the same as the name on his Fort Harkin transfer forms. The name on the discharge paperwork was also the name in the memory of the woman in the corner bunk. Briggs had not told Moss what the woman's name was. He hadn't needed to. He had described her and her location and the general nature of the desired outcome, And Moss had understood because Moss was someone who understood this kind of communication, which was part of how he had ended up on the wrong end of a discharge in 2008. They crossed the barracks floor in the dark toward the corner bunk. The corner bunk was empty. Not recently empty, made up with the precision of someone who had planned to be elsewhere. They stood around it with their flashlights crossing each other 4 beams in the dark, and nobody said anything for a moment. "Gentlemen," the voice came from the space between 2 bunks behind them, and it contained nothing that could be called alarm or anticipation, only the neutral acknowledgement of a situation that has developed as expected. Moss turned. She was 5 feet away, visible in the reflected light of their flashlights, and her face was the face of someone who has been watching them cross the floor and has been spending the time productively. His arm moved before his mind had fully authorized the movement, which is how people who have trained their bodies to act quickly under stress sometimes find themselves committed to a course of action before they've completed the decision to take it. He never completed the swing. Her hand was at his wrist, 2 fingers and a thumb, at a specific location below the heel of his palm, and the pressure was precise and sufficient, and his hand opened involuntarily, and what he'd been holding hit the floor, and then he was going down because the pressure was tracking up through his forearm toward his elbow, and going down was the only available option if he wanted the joint to remain intact. He went down. She held his wrist and looked at the 3 people standing behind him for long enough that each of them separately completed the same calculation, which ended the same way. Then she looked down at Moss. He knew that she knew who he was. Not face recognition knew. Specifically knew the year of the report, the finding, the paperwork, the name on the discharge. He could see it in the way she was looking at him, which was the way people look at things they have been expecting, rather than things that have surprised them. "Tell Briggs I said good night," she said. She released his wrist. He pulled it against his chest and pushed to his feet, and left, and the others left with him, and the barracks returned to the sound of 20 people lying still with their eyes open in the dark. Mara went back to her bunk. She lay down and looked at the ceiling. She added Derek Moss to the list. The list was long now. It had names and dates and specific actions and the relevant regulatory provisions that each action violated. It was detailed and accurate and entirely in her head where nobody could burn it. 2 days before General Crane's inspection, the tactical simulation had demonstrated something that wasn't in the assessment parameters, but belonged in them regardless. The simulation range at Fort Harkin occupied a converted warehouse, at the far end of the installation a space fitted with pop-up target mechanisms and a scoring board visible to the assembled unit. Standard assessment procedure: each recruit received a weapon from the armory cage, ran the qualification course, and was scored on accuracy, time, and procedural adherence. The scores were logged publicly on the board, which was by design a unit that can see its own performance. Metrics develops a particular relationship with collective accountability, or is meant to. Mara received her weapon from the cage at 1310. The armorer handed it across the counter without meeting her eyes. The weapon was a standard service rifle, and to a visual inspection, it was in adequate condition. The weight was right, the balance was right. The external surfaces showed normal wear. She performed the standard function check, and it passed, which was the point of the modification. A function check tests the firing pin's travel, not the specific geometry of its striking face, and the filing that had been done to the pin was precise enough to pass the check and produce a jam at the chamber rather than the mechanism. She ran the first target clean. The second shot produced the sound that a modified firing pin produces: a click rather than a crack, the particular auditory deflation of a weapon that has accepted the command and failed to execute it. Lauren's voice came over the loudspeaker before the echo finished. "Weapon malfunction. Recruit Stonewell. Dead in the field." There was laughter from some portion of the assembled unit, the kind of laughter that takes its cue from authority and understands that it has been given permission. Mara dropped to one knee. She stripped the bolt assembly in under 4 seconds. This is faster than most people who have trained the procedure can do it under calm range conditions. She did it here in front of the unit with laughter in the room and a 0 on the board and targets still cycling, which is a different set of conditions entirely, and the difference didn't register in her hands. She identified the modification by touch, the altered geometry of the pin's face, the specific tolerance that had been changed, and she cleared the chamber using a workaround that doesn't appear in any basic field manual because it was developed in a specific operational theater by people who had encountered this particular type of interference in circumstances where stopping was not available as an option. She cycled the bolt manually. She engaged the remaining targets one at a time, One shot per manual cycle, the mechanism requiring her to rack the action after every round, in a procedure that opened and closed the ejection port directly over her right hand, and on the third cycle, the port edge caught the knuckle of her index finger and opened the skin there cleanly. She kept cycling. Every target she was permitted to engage was engaged center mass. When Lorne cut power to the targets two-thirds through the sequence, the system he announced had experienced a technical fault. She was ahead of every score on the board. He logged her score as 0. She field stripped the weapon at the recovery station, identified the modified components, set them in a line on the counter in the order of their removal, and signed the equipment sheet with her name and the notation components modified filed for documentation. The armorer received the weapon back without looking at the notation. Mara photographed it with the small personal camera she was permitted to carry under the assessment parameters, which Briggs did not know about because the parameters were classified above his access level, and she added the photograph to the documentation file she had been building since day one. 0 on the board, everything else in the appropriate channel. She went back to the formation. The afternoon of Crane's inspection, Lorne presented the methodology to the general, and Crane signed the commendation, and the vehicles pulled through the gate, and Ferris unlocked the tablet in the empty parking yard and read what was in the document archive. And then came the false summit. That evening, Ferris found a reason to be near Briggs's office at 1830. He had fabricated a question about the inspection's supply requisition forms, which was the kind of procedural detail that nobody could object to being asked. What he actually wanted was to determine whether Briggs had said anything to Lorne about what might happen next, and whether either of them had noticed Ferris's extended time in the parking yard after Crane's departure. Briggs was in a good mood. Crane had signed the commendation. The inspection was closed. His program was running well. The woman in Barracks B had been shaved and assigned extra details and given a 0 on the tactical simulation, and her weekly assessment was a comprehensive failure on paper. Everything was proceeding the way it was supposed to proceed. He told Ferris that the supply forms could wait until morning. Ferris thanked him and returned to his temporary office, and he sat for a while without turning on the light, and the specific flavor of what he was feeling was the particular frustration of someone who has seen a situation clearly but has not yet located the lever that changes it. He thought about what Mara had said in the briefing room 9 days earlier when she corrected Lorne's sequencing. I know. She had said it to Lorne, but the words were available to multiple interpretations. He looked at his tablet. He thought about Crane's commendation signed and filed about the vehicles pulling through the gate, about the parade ground returning to its routine after the general left, about the fact that Fort Harkin would continue on its current trajectory for however long it took for a different kind of intervention to arrive, and about whether he was capable of accelerating that timeline, or whether the calculation he'd been running since he first saw the scar in the formation required patience he had not yet fully extended. He was still sitting in the dark when the thing he had been waiting for arrived from an unexpected direction. He received a message through the secure channel at 2116 characters, which decoded to 2 words at a time. The 2 words were "she knows." The time was 0045. He sat in the dark office for a while longer and thought about what it meant to receive a message you have been unconsciously expecting for 2 weeks, and to find that its arrival doesn't resolve anything, but clarifies what has to happen next. He thought about the 19 days he had been at Fort Harkin as an observer, and the 19 days Mara had been here as something he only now fully understood. He thought about Crane signing the commendation, about Lorne's voice delivering her own words back to a general who was nodding appreciatively, about the formations and the ammunition crates and the clipboard hitting the ground after the briefing correction, and the particular expression on Lorne's face in that moment, which he now understood was not irritation, but recognition. The recognition of a man who has heard a specific frequency and knows exactly what it means for him. Ferris thought about 2008 and the door and the voice. He had asked himself many times over the 19 years since what it would take to repay what had been given to him on that road in northern Iraq. He had come to understand gradually that the question was framed incorrectly. You don't repay that kind of thing. You carry it forward. You are in a situation and you do what the situation requires of you, and the thing you carry forward is the understanding of what it means to have been in a situation where someone else decided that was what the situation required of them. He put on his jacket. He went to find the equipment shed on the eastern perimeter. She was sitting against the exterior wall in the dark, her back to the concrete, her face toward the fence line when he came around the corner at 0048. He stopped 10 feet away. I've been thinking about how to start this conversation for 3 hours, he said. Don't start it, she said. Just say what you came to say. He sat down against the wall. Not close, both of them facing the same direction. The fence in the dark beyond it, in the desert making its long-distance sounds. Iraq, he said. August 2008. Route Copper 6 kilometers north of the firebase. Second vehicle took fire. I was in it. The door latch was compromised, and I was working it from the wrong angle. He paused. You came back. I remember. You talked me through the shoulder. Your voice never changed. I've spent a long time deciding whether that was training or something else. It was training, she said. Training that went deep enough that it became something else. He held the tablet without unlocking it. I pulled your file this afternoon, from the parking yard after Crane left. He let that sit for a moment. I also found the document archive, the 2003 paper and the 2005 publication. The fence wire shifted once in the night wind. You knew, he said. I knew. How long have you been building the case? Lorne is secondary, she said. He's a symptom. He stole from me because the architecture of the system permitted it. Because I was deployed when he published and couldn't contest attribution. Because the review board didn't look past his credentials. She turned her head toward him. The case I was sent here to build is larger than Lorne. Ferris went very still. Merck, she said. He had heard the name twice before in context that had made him uneasy. The second time had been 7 months ago, reading a classified summary that had not explained itself fully and had not been intended to. Brigadier General Alan Merck, she continued, Pentagon Force Development, washout program operating since 2013. Systematic elimination of high-performing female officers from advancement pipelines. Falsified performance records. Manufactured conduct violations. Deliberate placement in hostile command environments. She looked back at the fence. Fort Harkin is one of 6 installations. Briggs has been managing this one since 2018. He didn't design it. He was given a structure and told to operate it. He's following orders. He's following orders. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. I need Crane back here, before the inspection record closes. I need him present while the program is in active operation, and I need a credentialed witness who can testify to what they observed with no prior knowledge of the assessment parameters. That's why you needed me to pull the file. I needed someone to pull the file at the right moment, someone with the appropriate clearance and a reason to look. She paused. When I saw you at intake, I recalculated. I decided it was better that it was you, because you trusted me, because you already understood what you were looking at. I didn't have to establish it from zero. She turned her head towards him. Get Crane here by 0600. Tell him there's a documentation discrepancy in the inspection record that requires his signature before the window closes. That's true. The discrepancy is larger than he currently understands. Ferris considered this. He'll need more than a discrepancy. Generals don't make pre-dawn returns on a lieutenant's request. Tell him the discrepancy involves the attribution metadata on the methodology document he just commended. Tell him the author of record doesn't match the submission record. She looked at him steadily. He'll come. The tertiary authentication on the file. He'll need a code. Every general above 08 with force development oversight received a tertiary code in 2019 as part of the IG reform package. The codes don't expire. Most of them have never used theirs. She turned back to the fence. He just needs a reason to enter it. Ferris was quiet for a moment. The desert made its sounds beyond the wire, the shift of sand cooling faster than the rock beneath it, the small adjustments of organisms that live in the gaps between temperature extremes. When this is over, he said, the 6 other installations. Assessment teams. Different personnel, different approaches, same mandate. She paused. It takes as long as it takes. And Merck. Merck is Pentagon. That proceeds through channels that are already in motion. He knows an investigation exists somewhere. He doesn't know its current location. She was still looking at the fence. That's why the timing matters. He knows something is moving toward him. He doesn't know it's already arrived. Ferris thought about that, the elegant, exhausting completeness of it. 19 days of the program running at full confidence, filling in the case against itself with every action, providing evidence by operating, performing its own indictment without being aware of the audience. You couldn't have done this from the outside, he said. No. You had to be in it. Yes. You could have walked into Briggs' office on day 1 and told him what you were and why you were here. That would have given me Briggs, she said. I needed Merck. A long silence. The letter he burned, Ferris said, the one from the Pentagon mail channel. Confirmation that the documentation sequence had reached the appropriate recipient and the timeline was on schedule. Nothing in it that the burning damaged. She turned her head toward him. The burning was itself documentation. You saw the routing code before the fire reached it. You are now a witness to the destruction of official government correspondence by a non-commissioned officer. Ferris had the feeling of a man who has been watching a chess game from the side, believing he understood the position, and has just been shown that the pieces he was watching were not the pieces that mattered. "One more question," he said. She waited. "The night Moss came to the barracks, you were already awake, already positioned." "Yes." "How did you know he was coming?" She looked at him for a moment. Briggs made 3 calls from his office phone between 2100 and 2200 on the day he was assigned to Fort Harkin. The 3rd call was to a Reno area code. I had the number checked through a channel Briggs didn't know existed. The name that came back was Moss. She paused. "I've been awake every night since." Ferris stood. He stood for a moment above her, looking at the woman who had carried 80 pounds through 4 miles of Nevada heat and sutured her own arm in the dark and sat in a chair while someone dragged clippers across her skull and spent the time compiling a list. Who had been awake every night for 11 days waiting for an attack she had predicted and prepared for and absorbed and filed under evidence without breaking position. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He walked back toward the installation lights. She stayed where she was for 20 minutes listening to the desert's long, honest distances, and then she went back to the barracks and lay down on her bunk, and she looked at the ceiling in the dark and thought about the morning and what it would require. She was not afraid. Fear requires uncertainty about the outcome, and she had done the work to eliminate that uncertainty, and the work was complete. She closed her eyes. General Howard Crane's vehicle came through the Fort Harkin gate at 0547 alone. One vehicle, no advanced staff, no administrative complement. He had received Ferris's call at 0215 and had not gone back to sleep after it, which was information about the content of the call that Crane's driver, who had been driving generals long enough to read these things, registered without recording. Briggs was at the gate because Ferris had called him at 0510 with an instruction that contained no explanation. The general required the senior NCO at the main entrance at 0540. Briggs had arrived at the gate with the displeasure of a man whose sleep has been interrupted and the underlying unease of a man who has learned that unexplained summons at unusual hours are rarely good news for the person being summoned. Crane got out of the vehicle. He looked at Briggs with the expression of a man who has been awake for several hours reading things that have reorganized his understanding of where he is and what he has been doing here. He did not say good morning. He looked at the parade ground beyond Briggs's shoulder where the unit was beginning to assemble for the 0600 formation. "Where is she?" he said. Briggs knew immediately who was meant. He also understood in the way that people understand things they have been successfully avoiding that the avoidance was finished. "Formation, sir," he said. 0600 assembly." Crane walked toward the parade ground. Ferris fell in beside him, tablet in hand. Briggs followed 3 paces back. The unit had assembled by the time they reached the parade ground. Lorne was at the head of the formation running the morning count, and he saw the general and came to attention and opened his mouth to announce Crane's presence in the prescribed form. Crane raised one hand. Lorne closed his mouth. Crane walked the length of the assembled formation until he stood in front of Mara. He looked at her face, he looked at her scalp, he looked at the sutured cut visible below her rolled sleeve, and the way she held position, and he was reading all of it now with different information than he'd had the previous afternoon, and what he was reading was visible in the quality of his stillness. "Step forward," he said. She stepped out of the line. He turned to Ferris. Ferris handed him the tablet. Crane held it with both hands, and the red-bordered text of the Omega-7 interface reflected off the surface of his face in the early morning light, and he read for 90 seconds without speaking. Nobody in the formation spoke. Lorne, at the head of the formation, watched from 40 feet away with the expression of someone standing at the edge of something they cannot see the bottom of. Crane looked up from the tablet. He looked at Lorne. He looked at Briggs. He looked at the 23 faces in the formation. Then he looked back at Mara. "How long have you been here?" 19 days, sir." Something moved across Crane's face that was not any single identifiable expression, but occupied the territory where several converged: recognition, recalibration, the particular expression of a man who is realigning his picture of a situation he thought he understood. "Halt everything," he said. The parade ground went still in the way. It goes still when a general uses a particular frequency of command, not just the cessation of movement, but the cessation of the ambient sound of 23 people existing near each other, all of it stopping simultaneously. Crane turned to Briggs. Sergeant, explain the current condition of this recruit. Briggs had been in the Army for 22 years. He had learned over those years to assess, when facing a question from authority, how much the questioner already knows before deciding whether to construct a lie sophisticated enough to survive scrutiny. He looked at the tablet in Crane's hands. He looked at the red-bordered text. He performed the assessment. He said nothing for 4 seconds. Then something in his structure changed, not a collapse, but a controlled release of pressure that had been building for a long time and had finally exceeded the tolerance of the system containing it. 6 years of 0430 mornings and inventory modifications and conversations with Merck's office and paperwork that said one thing while the reality said another 6 years of accumulation finding the seam. Sir, he said, I need to report a matter involving Brigadier General Alan Merck. The name moved through the parade ground like a change in air pressure. Crane waited. Briggs spoke for 8 minutes. He spoke in the flat sequential manner of a man delivering a prepared statement he has rehearsed in private during many early mornings as a kind of insurance that had always been intended for exactly this type of moment. He described Merck's initial contact in 2017. He described the parameters of the program, the targeting methodology, the mechanism for falsifying performance records, the deliberate assignment protocols, the reporting structure, the 6 installations, the 11 years of operation. He described his own role in the Fort Harkin implementation in language that occupied the ambiguous territory between confession and testimony, and he understood that which category it fell into would be determined by someone other than himself. When he finished, the desert wind was audible. Crane looked at Mara. How long have you known about Merck? Long enough to let him think it was working, sir. Crane scrolled down the tablet with his thumb. Past the operational summary, past the commendations, past the classified after-action material. He reached the document archive. He stopped on the first entry. He read the second. He read the metadata connecting them, the dates, the submission records, the authorship fields. He scrolled to the bottom. There was an additional field, a tertiary level behind a code that required 3 separate authentication inputs from a general officer with Force Development Oversight clearance. He entered the code from memory, his thumb moving through the sequence with the unhurried precision of someone who had memorized it carefully and used it rarely, and the field opened. It contained a designation in 4 words. He stood with the tablet in both hands. He looked up slowly, and his voice when he used it was quieter than it had been, not diminished, more precise. The voice of a man choosing each word with the care of an uncertain footing. He looked at Lorne. You told me, Crane said, that no file means no value. Lorne said nothing. I heard you say it to the duty officer on my way in. You've said it in 3 briefings I've attended at installations in this region. It's the opening framing of the methodology document you presented to me yesterday. Crane turned the tablet so the screen faced Lorne, showing the document archive, 2 entries, one above the other. You've been quoting her methodology for 19 years. He turned back to Mara. His voice was almost entirely without register, now the voice of someone arriving at a destination they have approached with care. You're the architect. It was not a question. Mara said nothing. She looked at him with the steady, undemonstrative attention she had brought to every moment at Fort Harkin, the attention of someone who has prepared for a situation and is now present within it. General Howard Crane removed his cover. He held it at his side, bareheaded, on a Nevada parade ground in the early light, and the gesture required no explanation from anyone standing on that ground. Every person there understood it, from the colonels to the recruits, because some gestures carry their meaning in the doing of them and don't need words to complete it. Lorne's clipboard hit the ground. The sound was specific and final. He had looked at the tablet screen, at the document archive, at the October 2003 entry and the name in the author field, and at the March 2005 entry below it with its different name and its long, careful, well-maintained debt to the first, and something in his hands had opened and released the clipboard without being told to. He had built 19 years of career on a foundation that was standing 12 feet away with a sutured arm and a shaved head, and the complete indifference of someone who has already decided what they came here to do and has done it. He opened his mouth, he closed it. The 2 military police who had arrived with Crane in the single vehicle stationed at the edge of the parade ground during Briggs's statement moved at Crane's nod. They moved toward Briggs. Briggs did not resist. He had finished resisting in the private accounting of many mornings, and he brought his hands forward and let them be cuffed and stood with the particular stillness of a man experiencing something he has already lived through in rehearsal. The reality of it, he had found, was not easier than the rehearsals, but it had the same shape. Mara walked toward him. She moved without hurry. She stopped in front of him and looked at his face with the forensic attention she had applied to everything at Fort Harkin since the morning she arrived, and then she raised her right hand and took hold of the rank insignia on his collar. She removed it with a single clean motion. The sound of the fabric tearing was the loudest sound that had happened on the parade ground all morning, a short, decisive sound that ended before you expected it to, like a decision that's been waited on too long finally being made. She held the insignia for a moment, examining it the way you examine something, before determining whether it has any remaining value. Then she opened her hand and let it fall. It landed in the dirt at the exact location where she had been made to kneel. She did not look at it again. She turned to Lorne. He had been retreating in small increments since the clipboard left his hands, the unconscious movement of a man whose body understands the situation more accurately than his mind is prepared to accept. He stopped when she looked at him. There are things that stop when they encounter something genuinely immovable, and Lorne, for all his 19 years of performance, had never been immovable, and he could feel the difference now. His pension allocation, she said to Ferris, flag it for gross misconduct. Audit every program allocation from the past decade. Ferris's thumbs were already moving. Done. Accounts frozen. Assets flagged pending investigation. Lorne looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had spent 19 years signing his name to other people's work and drawing the compound interest on borrowed credibility. They were now the hands of a man with nothing left to sign, and the distance between those two descriptions of the same hands was the full measure of what this morning had cost him. He sat down on the ground, not dramatically. A structural failure, quiet and final, the way things fail when the load-bearing element is removed and the remaining structure understands in the simple physics of its own weight what it cannot sustain without the thing that's gone. Crane addressed the formation for 6 minutes. He spoke without notes in the clipped referential language of a general officer delivering an official statement to a recorded assembly, and in those 6 minutes he covered the suspension of Fort Harkin's current operational program, effective immediately, the referral of all personnel records from the past 6 years to the Inspector General, the initiation of a formal command investigation into the operation of the washout program at Fort Harkin and 5 other identified installations, and the pending referral of Brigadier General Alan Merck to the Joint IG investigation with Pentagon oversight. He said, command of this installation transfers to Colonel Stonewell as of 0600 hours today, pending the completion of the assessment period and the IG review. He said nothing else. He turned to Mara. Colonel, command is yours. She looked at the formation. 23 face in various states of comprehension, shock, and the particular expression of people who are running 19 days of witnessed events through a fundamentally altered interpretive framework, and finding that the new framework changes the meaning of everything. The pressure hose, the ammunition crates, the mail burning, the chair in the center of the parade ground, the clippers, the hair on the Nevada dirt. She looked at them for a long moment. In the third row, Travis Holt, the recruit who had laughed in the mess hall on the first morning, had the expression of someone who has just understood at full comprehension, rather than intellectual surface level, the specific nature of what he has been participating in. His face was doing several things at once, none of them comfortable. 2 rows forward, the recruit who had extended her leg to trip Mara on the 4th day had her eyes on the ground and her arms wrapped around her own chest in the posture of someone trying to occupy as little space as possible. The MP who had applied the shoulder lock during the head shaving was standing at parade rest at the perimeter of the formation with his eyes forward and his jaw so tight the line of it was visible from 40 feet. 19 days. 19 days of a system operating in full visibility, confident in its invisibility, and every moment of it logged, documented, attributed, and filed through a channel that the people running the system didn't know existed. The recruits would not be court-martialed. The recruits were 19 to 24 years old and had been following the example of the authority above them, which is what people do when authority provides an example, which is why authority is consequential and why the people who hold it are held to a standard that the recruits standing in this formation would need going forward to understand in their bones rather than their heads. That was what this morning would give them if they let it. She did not raise her voice. Fall out. Return to barracks. Assessment review at 0800. The formation dispersed in a silence that was different from the silence of a dismissed unit. People moved toward the barracks without the usual ambient release of group tension, because the tension hadn't ended. It had changed shape, and everyone present understood that what they were walking through was not a conclusion, but the beginning of an accounting that would take considerably longer than the morning. Weston Dryer was the last one moving toward the barracks when he stopped. He turned around. He stood at the edge of the parade ground, 19 years old, with a bruise still fading along his left cheekbone, and he looked across the length of the assembly area at the woman standing alone in the morning light. He came to attention. His hand came up in a salute. The arm at the correct angle, fingers together, elbow in the prescribed position, the full precision of someone who has been taught the mechanics of a gesture and is performing it now for the first time because the gesture means exactly what it means, because he means it rather than because the situation requires it. Mara was already turning toward the command building. She stopped. She turned back. She returned the salute, completely, without modification or qualification. The full weight of the gesture acknowledged and given back in the same measure. Dryer lowered his hand and walked to the barracks. Mara stood alone on the parade ground for a moment. The full Nevada morning was arriving now, the sun above the horizon and filling the desert with the particular flat honesty of high-altitude light that doesn't flatter and doesn't withhold. She looked at the installation around her, the barracks that needed maintenance visible from where she stood, the obstacle course with its unauthorized extension that would be corrected to regulation dimensions before the week ended, the equipment shed on the eastern perimeter where she had sat last night against the wall while the desert made its distances at her. She walked to the command building. The office had a desk, a chair, a window looking out on the parade ground, and a laptop connected to the installation's secure network. She sat down and opened the laptop and created a new document. The report took 2 hours. She wrote in the precise, unornamented language of someone who has been trained to make complex situations legible to people who weren't there. And she wrote without adjectives that carried editorial weight, without language that performed outrage, because the facts laid out accurately and attributed to their sources that are adequate to the purpose without embellishment. She wrote about the 19 days and the 23 faces and the mechanisms by which a system designed to produce soldiers had been converted with precision and deliberation into a system that eliminated certain soldiers before they could become what they were capable of becoming. She wrote about Briggs and Lorne and Moss and the 6 installations in the 11-year operation. She wrote about Merck in the language required by the proceedings she was initiating, which is a specific language with specific requirements, and she met those requirements the way she met all requirements, completely without waste, with the understanding that the work matters more than the worker's relationship to it. She wrote about the 19 days not as a record of what had been done to her, that framing would not have served the document's purpose, but as a record of what the program did when it operated without oversight, when it believed itself unobserved, when the people running it had every reason to be confident and no reason to be careful. When she was finished, she read it once from the beginning. She made 4 changes, all to sentence structure rather than substance. Then she transmitted it through the Omega-7 channel. Confirmation came at 14:12. At 16:30, the initiating authorization arrived for the broader investigation, which meant the file had been reviewed at the appropriate level and found sufficient. The next phase had begun. She closed the laptop and looked out the window at the parade ground, empty in the afternoon light. The Nevada sun at the angle between 4 and 5 o'clock that turns the desert's red soil almost orange, the daily transformation that happens when the light decides to do something interesting before it leaves. She watched it for a while the way you watch something when you know you won't be seeing it again. At 1700, a private from the duty roster lowered Fort Harkin's flag in the prescribed manner, folded it in the prescribed manner, carried it to the command building, and placed it on the desk in the corner. Nobody put it back up. Moved at the pace of institutional process, which is slower than the urgency of the people affected by it, and faster than the people under investigation would prefer, and which exists in precisely that gap, because the gap is where due process lives and has always lived. Briggs's court-martial took 11 days. He had cooperated fully with the Merck investigation from the moment of his statement on the parade ground, and the board noted the cooperation in language that was accurate and which produced a finding that was also accurate because cooperation and culpability are not mutually exclusive, and the board was clear-eyed about both. Reduction in rank. Forfeiture of retirement benefits accrued after 2018, the program's initiation date, at Fort Harkin. A permanent reprimand. On the final day of proceedings, asked if he had anything to add, he said only that 22 years was a long time to follow orders without asking whose they were. The board noted that too, and the notation was the most significant thing in his file, not because it mitigated anything, but because it was true. And true things have a weight in records that outlasts the record's immediate purpose. Somewhere years from now, someone reading about this period in the Army's institutional history would read that line, and the line would ask them a question about themselves, and the quality of their answer to that question would say something about the kind of officer they were going to be. That was the work that outlasts the proceedings. Briggs had not intended to contribute to it. He had anyway. Derek Moss was located at a civilian address in Reno, provided by Briggs without prompting, as part of the cooperation agreement, and charged with unauthorized use of a restricted installation and conspiracy to commit assault. He did not contest the charges. He told the investigator that he had known since the night in the barracks when she had held his wrist in the dark and he had seen what was in her eyes, that the paperwork from 2008 and the charges from 2024 would end up in the same file eventually. He said it without bitterness, which the investigator noted in the margin of his report with the word notable, and the observation that people who have been genuinely held accountable tend to describe it differently from people who have only been inconvenienced. Lorne's separation review required forensic analysis of metadata and submission records spanning 2 decades, and several officers who had built career citations on his work requested time to consult legal counsel before providing statements which added 3 weeks to the timeline but did not change the finding. The review board's language was precise. It described a set of actions in the specific terms those actions warranted, and the word it used was the accurate word, and accuracy was sufficient. His pension was reduced to statutory minimum. The Army Doctrine Repository processed an administrative amendment to the 2005 publication updating the authorship field to reflect the October 2003 working paper and its actual author. The amendment appeared to anyone accessing the repository as a routine correction, which was exactly what it was. The record correcting itself 19 years after the error was introduced. The Merck investigation was classified at a level above which its progress would be publicly reported. 6 other proceedings at other installations moved through their own parallel processes. Mara did not follow them. She had submitted the documentation and the referral, and what happened to those materials was in other hands, and those hands were the right hands, and she trusted the design because she had contributed to designing it, and trust grounded in understanding is the only kind that holds underweight. What she understood about Merck, which would not appear in any public record, was that he had not designed the washout program out of malice in the simple sense of that word. He had designed it out of a theory about organizational capability and pipeline management, and the kinds of people who made effective senior leaders, and the theory was wrong in ways that were by now well documented, but it had not been designed as cruelty. It had been designed as policy. The distinction mattered not because it changed what the program had done or who it had damaged, but because it changed the nature of the remedy. Cruelty requires punishment. Bad policy requires replacement. The replacement was already being written by people who understood the documentation that 18 installations had now generated, and it would look different from what it replaced because the evidence it was built on was different. That was the work that Mara had come to do. Not just the removal of the bad, the provision of the material for the better. She had never explained this to anyone who asked why she did it this way, why the careful, long approach rather than the faster, louder path. The answer was that the faster, louder path produces faster, louder responses, and the responses become the story, and the story consumes the evidence, and the evidence is the only thing that lasts. She had learned this in the 3 years it took her to understand what was happening, and the 4 years it took her to build a mechanism to address it, and she held the understanding the way you hold things learned at significant cost, carefully, practically, without sentiment. On her last morning at Fort Harkin, Mara walked the perimeter of the installation at 0500 before the unit assembled, while the desert still held its long, pre-dawn quiet. She walked the full perimeter. It took 40 minutes at her pace. She looked at everything the way she had looked at it on the morning she arrived, systematically registering the buildings and the equipment and the distances between things, the cargo wall now correctly dimensioned at 20 feet, the medical tent, with its new rotation, the equipment shed on the eastern perimeter, with its concrete block wall where she had sat on the last night of the operation. She was at the main gate when she heard boots behind her. Dreyer was in PT gear running the perimeter voluntarily as he had done every morning for 2 weeks. He stopped when he saw her. He came to attention. "At ease," she said. He relaxed. They stood at the gate together, looking out at the desert, which was taking on its morning color, the red-orange of Nevada soil emerging from the gray pre-dawn like something rising to its own surface. "Colonel," he said, "I'm sorry I didn't say anything. When it was happening, I watched and I stayed quiet." She looked at the desert. "You were at the crate after the 3rd course run," she said. "You fell in behind me on the ammunition carry." You stayed where you were and observed rather than participating. She paused. 19 days. You made the right choice in every way the choice was available to you. It wasn't enough. No, she said, it wasn't. And you'll carry that for the rest of your career, which means you'll be more useful than most. She picked up her duffel from the gatepost where she had set it before the perimeter walk. That's not a small thing, Dreyer. That's actually quite a lot. She walked through the gate. The transport vehicle was waiting on the road beyond the perimeter fence. She put the duffel in the back and got in the front, and the vehicle moved out onto the desert road, and Fort Harken reduced in the mirror first a collection of low buildings against the horizon, then a geometry of fence lines and flagpoles and the dark shape of the cargo wall against the morning sky, then nothing. She watched until it was gone. She sat with the goneness of it for a moment. Not with nostalgia, there was nothing at Fort Harken that merited nostalgia, but with the particular quality of attention that endings deserve the recognition that a thing has concluded, and the space it occupied is now different, emptier in some ways and clearer in others. 19 days. She had been sent to 18 installations over the course of the program's run, and 19 days was neither the shortest posting nor the longest. The shortest had been 11 days at a base in Georgia, where the program's operation had been so visible and so poorly concealed that the documentation work was straightforward and the conclusion was swift. The longest had been 31 days at an installation in Washington state, where the mechanisms were subtler and the paper trail required more patient excavation. Fort Harken fell in the middle of that range in terms of duration and near the top in terms of the deliberateness and scale of what she had found there. 23 faces, 14 names in the historical file she had read in Ferris's borrowed data. One name Merckx at the center of all of it, the structural architect of a program that ran on the premise that certain kinds of excellence were a problem to be managed rather than a resource to be developed. She had seen that premise operate in various forms over the course of a career that was now old enough to have its own history, and she had never been able to entirely account for it, for the specific human impulse that converts proximity to exceptional capability into a threat response rather than an opportunity. She had watched it happen to people around her for 20 years before she understood that the phenomenon was organized rather than accidental. The understanding had taken 3 more years to act on. The acting had taken 4 more years to architect. The 19 days at Fort Harken were the 18th iteration of an approach that was not perfect. No approach operating across the full range of human perversity could be perfect, but that had, over its 18 iterations, produced 17 completed investigations, 16 referrals to the Inspector General, and 1 pending case that was still in evidence-gathering phase at an installation in Colorado. She opened her laptop. The preliminary file for the next installation was already on the screen, organized into the sections she had designed the format to contain. Location command structure, known personnel pattern indicators from the metric analysis timeline of the assessment window. A different state, a different set of names, the same architecture underneath the same organized suppression, wearing a different installation's colors. The desert moved past the window, red and flat and indifferent, in the specific honesty of terrain that doesn't need you to believe in it to continue existing. It held its silence the way deserts hold everything, without preference, without judgment, keeping the record of every footprint and tire track in long operation until the wind came through with its patient erasure, and then keeping the record of the wind. She read for 40 minutes. Then she opened a new document and typed the header. Fort Harken Installation Assessment Complete. Commanding Officer Colonel Mara Stonewell. Classification Omega-7. Status filed. She closed it. She looked out the window at the morning light on the desert and the long road ahead, straight as a principal held under pressure, and she thought about Dreyer standing at the gate in his PT gear, with his hand raised in the correct position, because he meant it, and about Ferris sitting against the equipment, shed wall in the dark, saying, "Yes, ma'am," in the voice of someone who has finally found the right moment to pay a debt, and about the 14 women whose names were in the file and who had been processed out of the service through a system that had been designed to look like an honest assessment. She thought about what their careers might have been. The road ran straight through the red Nevada morning toward the next thing that needed doing, and she was the person going to do it, and that was enough. It had always been enough. The flag at Fort Harken had come down the morning. The suspension order was signed, lowered, correctly folded, correctly carried to the command building, and placed on the desk in the corner. Nobody put it back up.